This week on the Esther Krakue Show.
That promise hasn't just become harder, it's quietly died. This isn't you being dramatic, and it isn't you being bad with money, it's structural. In the UK, the average house now costs around 9 times average earnings, which is close to a record. We're not talking about skipping brunch for a year, it's the worst combination, high prices and high rates. So what can actually be done? How did an entire generation of people get locked out of homeownership? You know that old promise our parents grew up with? Work hard, save up, buy a home, and build a life? For a lot of people under 40 in Britain and America, that promise hasn't just become harder, it's quietly died. If you're a millennial or Gen Z, you probably don't even need the data to feel what I'm about to say. You feel it in your bank balance, in your rent payments, and in that low-level anxiety that spikes every time your landlord emails you. Still, the numbers matter, because they confirm that this isn't you being dramatic, and it isn't you being bad with money, it's structural. In the UK, back in 2000, almost 6 in 10 people aged 25 to 34 owned their home. Now it's about 4 in 10. That's a 20-point collapse for the exact same age group. And in the US, the story is a little more complicated. Overall, homeownership has recovered since the financial crisis, and millennials do buy homes, but they're doing it later, and they're doing it with much more debt in a market where house prices have sprinted away from wages. America's median home price now sits at roughly 5 times the median household income, up from about 3.5 times in the mid-1980s and early 2000s. At the same time, nearly half of renter households in the US now spend more than 30% of their income on housing. In England, the typical private renter spends about 1/3 of their income just to keep a roof over their head. And that's before you even feed yourself, pay for transport, or God forbid, think about having a child. So no, you're not failing at adulthood. You're trying to play an old game with a new rulebook, and no one bothered to tell you that the rules had changed. This is a story of how an entire generation was locked out of homeownership, but it's also about what that does to people's lives and what can realistically be done about it. First, let's be honest about what the numbers actually show, from prices, incomes, deposit, and age. In the UK, the average house now costs around 9 times average earnings, which is close to a record. Historically, something like 3 to 4 times your income was considered normal. The government sometimes claims affordability has improved recently, but that's mostly because interest rates have dipped after a brutal spike, not because homes suddenly became cheap. Meanwhile, renters are stuck. In England, the median private renter spends about 34% of their income on rent. In Wales, it's over 27%. For lower-income households in both the US and the UK, it's often much worse, with many spending more than 40% of their income just on rent alone. In the US, the mechanics are different, but the outcome is just as bleak. House prices have outpaced income for decades. By 2023, the ratio of median house price to median income had climbed at about 5.3% nationwide, compared with around 4% at the turn of the millennium. And that's before you even get to coastal metropolitan areas where the ratios are genuinely absurd. There's also a rule of thumb in America called the 28-36 rule, where you're supposed to spend no more than 28% of your gross income on housing. On a median household income, that would keep housing costs under roughly $2,000 a month. But in reality, the typical mortgage payment on a median home is closer to around $2,800, blowing way past that guideline before you even factor in childcare, student loans, or basic living costs. Then there's the age shift. In Britain, the average first-time buyer is now in their mid-30s, and in London, it's later still. Deposits have ballooned to levels that are completely detached from ordinary saving. We're not talking about skipping brunch for a year. We're talking about parents helping, inheritances, or a run of luck that most people simply don't have. In the US, millennials are more likely to own a home now than they were 10 years ago, but Gen Z homeownership sits at around 1/4, and many are either stuck renting or living with parents because the maths just doesn't work. A growing share of young adults are moving back in with their family, reversing the post-pandemic trend where some people briefly managed to get out. Put all of that together and the picture is clear. Prices are historically high relative to incomes, rents are swallowing paychecks, deposits have exploded, and the age at which buying becomes realistic keeps drifting further and further away. And none of this happened by accident. The first big driver of this is the boring one. We didn't build enough homes. If you strip away the politics, the most straightforward explanation is the most important. Both countries failed to build enough homes in the places where people actually need to live. In the US, estimates vary, but depending on who you ask, the country is somewhere between 2 and nearly 5 million homes short of what it needs. That shortage isn't an abstract number. It shows up as bidding wars for ordinary starter homes, investors outbidding families, and renters being hit with huge increases because there's literally nowhere else to go. And in England, it's the same story. Governments say the country needs around 300,000 new homes a year to keep up with demand and clear the backlog. But in reality, we've tended to build closer to 230,000 in a good year and much less when the economy turns. Over decades, that gap compounds and you end up with millions of missing homes. And a big reason for this is planning and zoning. In Britain, restrictive planning rules and the sacred status of the green belt make it extremely hard to build dense, attractive housing near the cities where the jobs are. Local councils fear angry homeowners turning up to planning meetings, so developments get shrunk, delayed, or killed altogether. The result is predictable. Sky-high prices for limited stock, and a generation priced out of the very city their labor keeps running. In the US, you see a similar pattern through single-family zoning and height limits. Huge parts of cities still only allow detached houses on sizable plots. Now that might have made sense in the 1950s, but in a world of persistent undersupply and high mortgage rates, it's borderline insane. Here's the simple truth. When you block new homes, you don't preserve community character. What you preserve is scarcity, and scarcity means high prices for people who bought earlier, paid for by everyone who came after them. The second driver is money, and specifically the long, strange era of ultra-low interest rates and what happened when it ended. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks in both the US and the UK slashed rates and kept them low for more than a decade. For a while, you could get a 30-year mortgage in America for around 3%, and in Britain, you could fix for 2 years at around 2%. Cheap money didn't make housing affordable. It made cheap debt abundant, which meant buyers could bid more for the same house. Prices rose much faster than incomes, but for a while, it didn't feel quite as brutal because the monthly payments were still looking manageable. Then inflation surged and the bill arrived. In the US, the average 30-year mortgage rate jumped from about 3% in 2021 to around 7% by 2023, and it stayed high. In Britain, 2-year fixed deals went from around 2.5% to nearly 7% at the peak. If you were already on the property ladder, the payment shock when your fix expired was brutal, but at least you owned an asset. If you were renting and hoping to buy, you got hit twice. Years of cheap debt had inflated the house price, and then the cost of borrowing to buy that inflated house doubled. That's why so many younger people feel trapped. It's the worst combination: high prices and high rates. Even now, with rates easing a bit, the damage is done because prices have not collapsed to match. In the UK, prices have been broadly flat at historically high levels. In the US, most forecasters talk about a slow reset rather than a crash. So when older generations say, oh, rates were higher in my day, they're not entirely wrong, but they're applying those rates to much cheaper houses with lower price-to-income ratios. You're facing inflated prices and historically punishing monthly payments with wages that simply haven't kept pace. Then there's the political help that often ended up helping prices instead. At this point, politicians panic because the idea of voters being locked out of homeownership is politically toxic. So they keep inventing schemes that claim to help first-time buyers. The problem is that when supply is constrained, most demand-side help ends up being absorbed into higher prices. Take the Help to Buy scheme in the UK. On paper, it helped first-time buyers purchase new-build homes with smaller deposits topped up by government equity loans. In reality, researchers found that it pushed up new build prices, and a significant chunk of the benefit flowed straight into the house builders' profits, not into buyers' pockets. More broadly, loosening lending rules doesn't fix the mismatch between supply and demand. If you let people borrow more, stretch mortgages to 30 or 40 years, and raise loan-to-income caps, you don't create more houses. You simply enable higher bids for the same limited stock, and prices rise to meet the extra credit. In the US, the system has long been tilted toward people who already own property through mechanisms like tax advantages for homeowners. Renters, who are often the ones most squeezed, get nothing comparable. And then there's the quiet decision in both countries to treat housing as an investment class rather than a basic foundation of life. That choice pulls us to the next piece of the story: investors, Airbnb, and the financialization of shelter. Whenever the housing crisis comes up, someone will inevitably say, this is all because BlackRock is buying up the houses. That's not quite right. Institutional investors in the US still own a relatively small share of single-family homes. So no, a giant firm is not literally buying up every house on your street. But focusing only on that misses the bigger point. Investors of all sizes, from people with one extra rental to large firms, play a growing role in many markets. In early 2025, investors bought a very large share of homes sold in the US, meaning that first-time buyers are often competing not just with other families, but with buyers whose entire business model is turning homes into yield. Short-term rentals add to that squeeze in places where supply is already tight. Studies in both Europe and North America show that as short-term listings expand, rents and prices tend to rise because properties are pulled out of long-term housing stock and converted into tourist accommodation. In the UK, buy-to-let was actively encouraged for years through tax treatment and policy choices that treated property as a semi-sacred wealth vehicle. We've moved away from that model since, but not before a generation of landlords snapped up stock that might otherwise have been owner-occupied. The point is that not every landlord is evil, or that investors should be banned. The point is that we took something as basic as shelter and treated it primarily as a financial product, and now we act surprised when people who just want a stable place to live feel permanently stuck at the back of the queue. Then there's the impact on what this does to real lives. Housing is often discussed in dry language: price to income ratios, rent burdens, lending rules. It's easy to forget that behind every statistic is someone trying to work out whether they can afford a baby and their rent increase in the same year. Housing is not just an asset, it's the platform on which you build everything else: relationships, work, family, community, and stability. Rising housing costs are reshaping life milestones in both the US and the UK. Many millennials and Gen Z are delaying marriage, delaying children, and putting off basic decisions because housing costs and financial insecurity make long-term planning feel like a joke. Young adults are also far more likely to live with parents or do the boomerang back home than in recent decades. In Britain, Generation Rent has become a permanent category, not a temporary stage on the way to buying. This has mental health consequences too. Housing insecurity, that's the constant fear of being priced out when your lease is up, or the stress of moving repeatedly because rents rise, is associated with chronic stress, worse well-being, and a sense of instability that bleeds into everything else. For children, frequent moves and overcrowding are linked to worse educational outcomes and mental health problems, not because parents don't care, but because the market creates precarity by design. And there's a political effect as well. When a generation feels the system is rigged against them, and when their parents bought homes at 3 times their income while they face 8 or 9 times, and when they're paying 40% of their wages in rents just to exist, trust in institutions starts to erode. Housing sits at the heart of whether people believe life is getting better or worse, and for many, the answer is increasingly feeling like worse. So what can actually be done? Let's be realistic, one video is not going to fix the housing crisis, but there are levers that matter, and it helps to separate them into 2 categories. So what individuals can do inside a rigged system, and what we should be demanding politically if we want the next generation to have a different experience. So what can individuals do? Well, first, the obvious point that needs to be said is, you didn't cause this, and no amount of skipping lattes will fix it. That said, you can still play the hand you've been dealt more deliberately. It helps to think of housing in terms of location and time, rather than an ideal house as your first buy. The old fantasy of the perfect home in the perfect area as your first purchase is increasingly unrealistic. The question becomes where you can get on the ladder, even if it isn't your forever home. That might mean looking at cheaper regions, accepting a longer commute, or leaning into hybrid work, targeting smaller homes that don't attract as much investor competition, or choosing secondary cities where wages are still decent and the price-to-income ratios aren't completely deranged. If co-buying becomes the only realistic option, do it with legal protection. Buying with a partner or friend, or even family, is now common because deposits have become so extreme, but you need proper arrangements about ownership shares and what happens if someone wants out. It also helps to treat renting strategically, not as a mark of failure. If buying is out of reach in your market, you can still aim to keep housing costs under a sensible share of income where possible, negotiate longer tenancies where the law allows, and actually learn your tenant rights because landlords are not always honest about what you're entitled to. Debt matters as well. Student loans, car finance, credit cards, all of this feeds into what lenders will offer you. If buying is a real goal of yours, prioritizing high-interest consumer debt can make a difference, not because it solves the market, but because it improves your position inside it. And finally, don't chase the market out of panic. Stretching yourself to breaking point because you've been told that prices will only ever go up can backfire badly in a world of high interest rates and economic uncertainty. If you're going to stretch, do it with your eyes wide open and a buffer in place, not because TikTok told you that renting is throwing your money away. And here's what we should be demanding if we want the system to change. The first step is to accept that supply is the foundation. Both the US and UK need sustained periods of building more housing than they're used to in the places where demand actually is. That means zoning reform in American cities, allowing more mid-rise apartments and missing middle housing, loosening height and density limits near transport and job centres, and streamlining planning in the UK so local veto politics can't block new homes indefinitely. Secondly, governments should stop pretending that demand subsidies fix affordability. Mortgage guarantees, equity loans, stamp duty holidays, tax breaks that inflate buying power all tend to push up prices when supply is constrained. Public money is better spent building physical homes, funding infrastructure that unlocks new building sites, and genuinely supporting affordable housing. Third, if renting is going to be a long-term reality for a large share of people, we need to treat it as a legitimate tenure rather than a holding pen. That means stronger protections against no-fault evictions, limits on arbitrary rent shocks, enforcement of basic quality standards, and longer-term tenancy options so families aren't forced to move constantly. None of this has to destroy the rental market, by the way. Plenty of European countries manage professional landlord sectors alongside real tenant security. Fourth, tight markets should regulate short-term lets and second homes more seriously. Airbnb is not the sole cause of this crisis, but in supply-constrained tourist-heavy areas, it does make things worse by pulling homes out of long-term stock. Registration schemes, caps in high-pressure areas, and tax treatment that reflects the social cost are all reasonable tools, especially if the revenue funds affordable housing locally. Fifth, it's worth revisiting how we tax housing and land. One reason housing became such a speculative asset is that governments often tax work more heavily than land. Land value taxation is politically difficult, but many economists argue it's one of the least distortionary ways to raise revenue and can reduce incentives to land bank while encouraging productive development. It isn't a magic bullet, but as the current system grinds younger voters down, formerly taboo ideas are going to sound much more sensible. But above all, we need to treat housing as infrastructure. If nurses, teachers, bar staff, and delivery drivers cannot afford to live anywhere near where they work, cities stop functioning. Government should plan housing the way they plan roads, rail, and power, as something that underpins everything else and therefore requires long-term, boring, serious policy, not short-term schemes designed to win headlines. Finally, it's easy in the thick of all of this to internalize the idea that you failed. You're in your 30s and still renting, maybe still sharing, maybe even back living with your parents. You hear stories about your mum buying a house at 24 on one salary and start to think, what's wrong with me? The answer is nothing is wrong with you. You're trying to do adult life in a system that quietly rewrote the rules and never told you. We underbuilt homes where they were needed. We flooded markets with cheap debt. We treated houses like chips in a casino rather than places to live. And then we told the generation growing up in this chaos that if they just worked a bit harder and skipped avocado toast, they would be fine. They would be, not without structural change. But that doesn't mean you're powerless either. You can still make tactical decisions about where and how you live. You can press local representatives on planning reform, renters' rights, and social housing, rather than just screaming into the void online. You can refuse to let shame about renting or living with your parents define your sense of adulthood. Homeownership, at its core, is about security and control over your life. If an entire generation has been locked out of that, it's not because they lost the plot, it's because those in charge did. And the first step to changing it is saying that out loud.